Yes, good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Adesoji Speaks. And today we're teaching African history, its importance. And we have a special guest with us today. He is a teacher, an author, and in his spare time, he also goes around discovering known places. He's known to have discovered a couple in his time. Most recently, River Gulu in London, which apparently the natives called some unfathomable word. I believe they call it the Thames. And his illustrious work of helping to underscore the importance of nature to the natives has not gone unnoticed by none other than the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who also, in the course of doing so, knighted him and observed that although he has done it without bloodshed, I don't know how
Yes.
you can go around conquering places without bloodshed. But then again, without taking the man's thunder, I would allow Mr. Comrade Milton Allimadi to further tell us a bit more about himself. Brother.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Conrad, for hosting me on your show. I like interacting with people who are serious about African history as well, such as yourself. I've rarely met individuals that have such rich libraries of African books related to our African continent. And it's something that we need to keep promoting, because that really is the weapon that we need to our liberation, As Comrade Steve Biko said, right? The most potent weapon in the hands of our oppressors is the mind of the oppressed. So we need to liberate our minds. And I think that's something that is why I became interested in writing, in journalism, and then, of course, in history. So I started writing when I think I was about maybe 10 or 11 years old. And of course, 10, 11, you still don't have much direction, right? You read books that your parents buy, you read in the library, and you sort of fancy yourself as an author too, right? But no focus, no direction. I think my serious writing started when I started reading books by Achebe, by Ngugi, whom you mentioned, particularly books like Decolonizing the Mind. And then, of course, you refer to books that they refer to as well in their writings. Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, Mohammed Abdurrahman Babu.
Yeah.
And then much later on, when I became very interested in economics and political economy, books by Samir Amin. Although, Samir Amin is difficult to read. His books are very thick.
Yes.
The language is...
His subject matter is also very...
it's very dense.
Very dense, yes.
Yes, but
let's
very
just
critical
say
too.
purely academic.
I prefer his speeches. In fact, his speeches are much more accessible. But the writing, of course, is brilliant too. You just have to be patient. And you have to have time to get into it. So that's why I became very interested in writing. And then even from a young age, even from a very young age, before I became serious in interest in serious writing, when I still didn't have much focus, I noticed one thing. I think I was about maybe 12 by then. At that time, my family was living in Tanzania. We had fled from Uganda during the reign of General Idi Amin. I used to go a lot to what's called, I think it was called the United States Information Services, USIS.
USIS back in the
And
day.
then you'd read magazines like Newsweek, Time Magazine, Washington Post, New York Times. And then I think the British also had their own version. I forget what it was called now.
I was the
British something.
British Council.
Yes, British Council. And the Germans had something called, I think, the Goethe Center, right?
So
I noticed
Institute.
The Western representation, depictions of Africans are always as, backward, tribal. And even at an early age like that, you get the sense that there's something missing, a hierarchy of human beings. So that bothered me a lot. although I was not yet intellectually equipped,
Mm.
apart from just feeling the frustration, right? And
Mhm.
then it took when I was in uh, in college at Syracuse University, when the professor was in the English class, and he was reading from Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and reading passages where Africans are being described in the most demeaning, racist way. But he was elated. And the class, of course, responds to how the professor is also elated and
Mm.
praising the book and saying this is one of the best books ever written in the English language.
Mm.
And I felt there's something wrong here. If that is true, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Right?
Mm.
Very
Mhm.
uncomfortable. My skin is tense. I feel like every sentence he's reading is insulting me.
To me, yep, yep.
But most of my peers, European American students, they're appreciating it because they believe in what a professor is teaching, correct?
Mm. Mm.
So that incident never really um, escaped me or disappeared from my mind.
Mm.
But even at that time, I was not yet intellectually equipped to say, Professor, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong. You see?
Hmm.
And that's why I come back to the appreciation of history and knowledge of our African past.
I
And
mean,
it took
that's
many years before I assembled enough knowledge to where we are now sitting and having this conversation.
yeah. I mean, that's point there where you said the professor made based his premise or his allusion of understanding the continent on primitive images of Africa. What brings me to my first question to you today, which is how and why do you think those primitive images were created and universally disseminated? Why would you
Well,
think?
very obviously, you don't understand this until you start reading history
Mm.
and political economy.
Mm.
And I like saying this to people now. Um, if you haven't, anybody who's listening, if you haven't read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, you need to read that book. And then you find out that in the earlier era, even before enslavement of Africans for labor
Mm.
became prominent,
Yeah.
the British would literally enslave fellow Britishers, fellow Europeans, and take them to work on the plantations.
Mm.
It was all about profit. So those Europeans taken to work on the plantations also demonized. They were scoundrels. They were riffraffs. They were inmates in the
Vagab-
prisons. They used to empty the
vagabonds.
prison and send them to work on the plantation, which is like what they did when that's how they
Mm.
settled and stole Australia, right?
Mhm.
So at one point, obviously, they realized that Africans had superior agricultural technology. People keep talking about the physical power. That was only part of it. The key part was the technology of
Mm.
agriculture.
Mm.
There's a difference between just going and plowing.
Being intentional about it. Yes.
Exactly. Knowing when to plow, when to plant, how to control soil that is not that productive, and how to
Mm.
preserve it, how
Mhm.
to create irrigation systems, how
Mm.
to farm on the hills by slope farming. That's technology, you see?
Mm.
So that's why Africans became very desirable for labor. But now you have a problem. How are you going to be subjugating fellow human beings
Mm.
and treating them like animals, working from dawn to sunset every day? So in order to deal with that problem, that is where the philosophy of demonization started. We have to convince people who are not involved, who are just observers,
Mhm.
as well as the ones that are involved, that these are not fully developed human beings. They
Mm.
may resemble human beings, but they're not quite to the level of we Europeans. So, in order to justify that exploitation, they
Mm.
needed an ideology to support it. And that's where the ideology of white supremacy became very, very prominent. There's a lecture that I refer to in my book as well. And The lecture is by Walter Rodney. I think it was around 1979 that he gave that lecture at Columbia University. And it's on YouTube, and it's called, what's it called? Race and Politics in Guyanese. No, Race and Class in Guyanese Politics. Race and
Race and
Class.
class.
And one of the points he makes is that, yes, racism may have existed before the rise of capitalism.
Okay.
But there's a very qualitative difference between the racism that was used to form the foundation of capitalism.
Okay.
That racism then assigned you a role in the production system. Of course, with non-Europeans as laborers, Europeans as supervisors. It also assigned your access to resources. If you're non-European, you're not entitled to land. You're not entitled to all these mineral resources, the gold, the silver, what have you. But if you're European, you have the first take on it. So that's how the philosophy of racism really, and if you notice, it's not by accident. Why is it that you don't find that during the era when capitalism was really expanding all over the world, you wouldn't say, oh, the British are racist, the French are not, the Germans may be racist, the Dutch are not. Why was it so uniform and consistent and prevalent? Because they worked it out, they wrote books about it, and it was not accidental, it was well planned. And that's why I kept going back to the term manufacturing, because you have to really plan it out and then disseminate it in a certain way so that it's not random. If it was not planned, then you would expect to find, okay, some of these Europeans seem to be much more racist. These don't seem to be racist. But all of them during the expansion of capital, at least the ones that were engaged in imperialism had to be racist as well.
So, which brings me to, obviously, you mentioned the stigma of the skin, because if you've indoctrinated the people to believe that they're less than, but why is it that even though evidence were bound, and when I say evidence, the Zimbabwean ruins, the Kanem-Bornu Empire, Kemet, all existed in the same time, how come people were able to divorce this from what they were seeing? What would you put that down to?
Oh, very good. But the human mind can be conditioned to do anything, right?
Yep.
So, in their writings, they were quite obvious about it. It was so ridiculous. But you can choose to believe, or at least you can choose to pretend to believe what you really don't believe, right? So, for example, the ruins of Zimbabwe. They said Africans could not have built these ruins in Greater Zimbabwe. The Benin carvings, the bronze, and anybody who has not seen the Benin bronze, you owe it to yourself while you're still alive. It should be one of the things you do. Go to a museum or see it, or go online and Google Benin bronze and Google images and take a look at those spectacular, breathtaking images. Not only the art behind it, but the engineering work. So when they encountered it, they said, no, this could not have been done by Africans. So even though we claim to be the first Europeans who are here, there must have been earlier Europeans before us here, right? So that was some of the logic and rationale. And the same thing applies for Kemet, of course, aka ancient Egypt. How could Africans have built these temples, these pyramids, these irrigation systems? It's not possible, right? So long as, even if you don't find a satisfactory answer, you believe in your heart as a European that it could not have been done by Africans, even if there's no other better explanation, that is sufficient to them.
Hmm.
Just to conclude that no, it could not have been done by Africans. I don't know how it was done or who did it, but it was not African. You see? And then, of course, the knowledge has come a long way because of scholars like the late Professor Anta Diop, who proved conclusively by doing the melanin testing, taking tissue samples from ancient Egyptian mummies and testing the melanin content and finding out conclusively that the melanin level was consistent to Africans that look like you and I. So at least the people who believe in science, that's not an issue to debate anymore. But of course, the politics of denial is still very strong, even in Egypt itself, where the true history is not taught. There's a rejection of the truth taught by Anta Diop. So we still deal with that issue even in our contemporary era.
Okay. And so, speaking of contemporary times, it's often said that newspapers hold the first draft of history. Why do you think reporters who, even you are talking about it being an ongoing struggle with regards to the depiction of Africa, so why do you think reporters who travel to cover the continent feel the need to play to certain stereotypes in books like which you reference in your book, by the way, which is manufacturing hates, how the West demonized Africa. Yeah. So you mentioned the fact that when they do travel to you, they still play to those stereotypes, and those stereotypes have played well in history.
Yes.
With regards to the depiction of the Mau Mau, with regards to the apartheid cause, the almost near erasal of the genocides of the Herero and the Namas.
Absolutely.
The painting of the murder of the likes of Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, Civilio Olympio, and the list is endless.
Right.
So why do you think the press, which should be, reporting factual and accurate records, also still play to the stereotypes that were obtained in the books that are gone before?
Okay. And as the other famous saying about the lion, the hunter, and the lamb, right?
Yeah.
It is
That
those
is
who get to tell the story.
Yes.
Who set the narrative. And newspapers are only a reflection of the owners of the press, the particular ruling class, the particular dominant class. The press does not just appear out of nowhere, correct?
Yeah, true.
It has a
They
group
don't
of people
operate in
who
a
come
vacuum.
together
Yes.
to say this is the kind of narrative that we want to promote and to propagate. And people often forget that, They think it just comes and it forms itself, and then it becomes like a magazine or a newspaper or books. No,
The
there's already
intentionality
a
is
preset agenda behind it. So obviously, we could not expect that the media of Britain during the era when Britain was imperial and conquering the world and dominating non-Europeans and exploiting non-Europeans, we could not expect the press to be on the opposite page. So, for example, Samuel Baker. And Samuel Baker is, to me, one of the best examples, and he's the best teacher in terms of his writing. Because in his writing, Albert Nyanza, and I now forget exactly when Albert Nyanza was published in the 19th century. There are sections where he says the Africans cannot be compared to the noble character of the dog, right? He says that.
Yeah.
Over the most demeaning, racist depictions and representations. But then, in the same chapter, He's promoting imperialism and expansion of trade and commerce. You know,
Hmm.
he's
Hmm.
in these savage lands, but he's saying we need to show the savage that we can mutually benefit by the savage importing goods from England
Hmm.
and England importing from the savages. So
Wow.
obviously, he sees the benefit of commerce and expansion of capitalism. And that is the true intent. That's the
Hmm.
primary agenda, really.
Okay.
Accumulation.
Of
The
resources.
racist language depictions is all part of the philosophy to justify exploitation and domination. And Baker is the best example because he puts them together. In some books, a book is devoted entirely to just racist depiction and demonization.
Hmm.
They do their job, they separate, and then they have others write books about the expansion of capitalism to these areas. But Baker combined them, and that is why he provides the best proof and evidence that this was the true agenda, that
Hmm.
the racist depiction and demonization was just a cover to promote capitalist expansion. And that's not to say that it's not harmful, even though it was a cover.
Mm-hmm.
It led to the extermination of so many peoples historically
Hmm.
throughout the world.
Hmm.
And its residue, and I even hesitate to call it residue, of that racist depiction is still manifest in our contemporary era. So let me give you a very vivid example
Go on.
that we see on a daily basis. We are witnessing a 21st century genocide being live streamed,
Hmm.
right, on TV networks, on
Social
social
media.
media against the people in Gaza, the Palestinians.
Hmm.
And yet, there are huge segments of the European population and non-European population as well, who are not as outraged as they would be if those people were Europeans. Just think about it.
Hmm.
Do you think it would be tolerated if the Palestinians were non-Europeans to be bombarded like that, to lose maybe almost 15,000 children
Hmm.
and women? But the mind has been conditioned to see them as lesser beings compared to Europeans.
Hmm.
And that also affects even non-Europeans. You know, there are some Africans who are not as bothered as you and I by what is going on.
Because
And
they've been
that tells you the
conditioned.
power of what was done in terms of the racist depiction. As you and I know, Fanon did a very brilliant job working on
Hmm.
that, writing on that,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, black skin, white mask,
A mask. Yep.
you know, where you find that some Africans internalize that sense of inferiorization and believe that the only way to overcome that inferiority is to identify with the Europeans,
Yes. Yep.
European language,
Leopold
European
Senghor.
European culture, European music, European attire. You know, that is in other words, anything that sheds any semblance of a connection to Africa is
Hmm.
defined as civilization, you see?
Civilization.
Right.
Okay. I mean, so which obviously then brings us nicely to the to what way do we actually resist this in terms of that? So how does African resist this? I mean, in your book,
Right.
you give us examples of uh, Empress Tatu and Emperor Menelik, destroying the
Very
Italian
good. I'm glad you
invaders.
brought that example up. Very good.
You,
I'm glad you
you
brought
know,
that example because
yeah.
as you and I and most of our viewers, I hope, know, Ethiopia was the only African country that was not militarily conquered and colonized during the scramble for Africa between the last 20 years of the 19th century, right? 1880 primarily to 1900, and the Berlin Conference when they met, partitioned the continent, and then they said, well, now that they've partitioned it on paper, in order to now administer, you have to go and have boots on the ground, right? Send your military, send your colonial officers. So Italy tried to do that against Ethiopia. And it ties very well with our conversation because the Ethiopians did not believe they were inferior to anyone,
In itself, an
not
act of
the Europeans.
resistance. Yeah.
They said they're coming to invade, we will engage them in war. And in fact, they were very strategic, particularly Empress Taitu, the empress and wife of Emperor Menelik. After they discovered the deception, because Italy had come, they'd signed an agreement for trade and amicable relations, the Treaty of Wuchale. And then they had two versions, one in the Amharic, one in the Italian. And then the Italian version, the language was different. In the Amharic version, the empire, if they wanted to deal with other European countries, they had the option to use Italy as their intermediary. But the Italian version was very explicit, made it clear that they were obliged to deal through Italy, essentially made it a protectorate, a colony. So when they discovered that, they did not declare war immediately because they knew the Italians had a military advantage in weapons. So they used a period of 4 or 5 years or so, engaged in tiny skirmishes here and there, but not outright war. They used that period to build up their own domestic produced rifles, as well as imported a lot of weapons from other European countries, because they also used the same tactic that the Europeans used to conquer most of Africa, divide and rule. They knew that all the Europeans were not on the same page either, right? So they got arms through that way. And then finally, they were ready. And of course, they engaged at the Battle of Adwa, that I devote a chapter to as well in my book. And that was in March 1, 1896. And the Italian commander, Oreste Baratieri, had promised King Umberto, at that time, Italy was still had a monarchy, that he was going to return with the emperor and the empress in cages, so they can display them in the zoo, because they were just deep-seated racist attitude toward Africans. So they were completely shocked when that army was completely annihilated at the Battle of Adwa, killing about 3,000 Italian soldiers, more than 2,000 of their other allies that conscripted African soldiers from Eritrea, which had already been conquered by Italy, captured another 3,000. And here's the key thing, which I like the most. Two things, actually. One, I like the fact that Empress Taitu herself had 6,000 men under her command on the battlefield. So she has not been given her adequate dues. And as you know, I have a book on that as well. And I give her the adequate dues. I made her the key character in my book, Adwa, Empress Taitu and Emperor Menelik in Love and War. I give her just dues. But here's the second point I wanted to make. They marched the thousands of European Italian prisoners back to the capital of Addis Ababa, that was named by the Empress herself. beautiful flower, it means, and made them work under supervision of Africans. You see? Yeah. So they got to taste how it felt
Putting them to
to
good
be
use.
dominated and
Mm.
to be instructed with the Africans as their masters this time. And that is why this story is not widely known in the rest of the world, in Europe, even in Africa itself. So you find Africans that are not even familiar with the Battle of
What's it?
Adwa. How can it
Yeah.
be that this is not taught in every African classroom by the time you leave primary 7 to go to secondary school? You see?
Mm.
So I like that. And you asked the other question, how do we end this? Right?
Yeah.
How do we free ourselves from this? And it comes from knowledge. It comes from knowledge. It comes from our people knowing that not all Africans just succumb and say, oh, yes, you're welcome in colonialism. That's not true. There was resistance. There were many resistance that are not well documented. As you know, in West Africa, you had Samore Touré, who fought the French and defeated them in many battles for almost 14, 15 years until he was betrayed and captured. The Ashanti Wars lasted until the turn of the century, right, into the
Yeah.
20th century. So resistance has been there. The resistance in South Africa, the resistance in Tanzania, resistance in Kenya, and that
Angola.
comes from not accepting the sense of inferiority. And that comes knowledge of your history, knowledge of yourself. But if the history was being written by the colonial administration, then obviously the history would have Africans in a subservient role. So you ask, how can it change? The other answer to your question is we need to revise all of our curricula in every African country. When you have the meetings of the African Union, the most important meeting should be the meeting of the ministers of education.
Yeah.
I know right now one of the most important meetings are the ministers of foreign affairs. That is important, yes. But I submit the meeting of the minister of education is much more important than the ministers of foreign affairs, because the ministers of education and the curricula would then be responsible for the type of African intellect that we produce in our classrooms from the primary level to the secondary schools through the university. You can still be an engineer, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you could be an accountant, but at the same time, we should all have a certain type of knowledge of ourselves that is consistent, that we are not inferior to anybody because we have the history behind it. In fact, and this is what another thing that is not widely taught, and which I find my students find very liberating, the fact that had Africans not migrated away from the continent about maybe 100,000 years ago or so, everybody in the world would look like you and I. So how can we be inferior to anybody? It was Africans who migrated to the other parts of the world, and over a period of tens of thousands of years, adapted to those new environments and the new climatic conditions. And the climate was very different back in those days. The cold was bitter, bitter cold. They did not need the melanin content. So they took on new features and new skin tones. So they are, in fact, us and owe their existence to us. How can we be inferior to people who owe their existence to us? We're the same. There's no difference between Europeans and Africans. There's no intellectual hierarchy, as under Job taught. There's only superficial difference due to the adaptation. But if you go to the DNA, it's consistent. In fact, Europeans now have traced, just using DNA back dating or back marking, to their location where they originated from in East and Central Africa. That's how much science has now improved. So the fact that we still have this level of so-called racism, right? It shows you the power of miseducation, really.
Mm. Mm.
Mm-hmm. The power of miseducation.
So, how can we, in this age of social media, new technology, and what have you, and now artificial intelligence, arrest the trend of Africa's negative depiction on those various through
In
those
fact,
various
that
media?
we now have no excuse. We have the best opportunity and chance to do it now, because now the so-called brick and mortar
Mm.
media, who
Mm.
had dominated information for such a
Legacy
long
media.
time, they don't have that type of monopoly anymore. They still do, in the sense that they have the resources to disseminate misinformation.
Economies of scale. Yeah.
But we now have an opportunity to deconstruct that misinformation. And if you do it a good way, people will recognize and start coming to your media, your
Mm.
platform, and will promote your media. So that's what we need to do. Deconstruct effectively, and then, of course, disseminate to the right people and get them to disseminate. So what I do, for example, and I really
Mm.
like this, that it's working. One of my students from last semester
Okay.
is taking another class with me this semester. And the first day of class this semester, at the end of the class, she said something which really warmed my heart. She said, "Professor, the interview with Cheikh Anta Diop," and anybody can Google it, go to YouTube, interview with Anta Diop. The interview was conducted by Listervelt Middleton, Listervelt, and then Middleton is the last name.
Okay.
And the interview is only 58 minutes, but it really breaks it. It breaks down some of the information I've been sharing today. But this is what she told me. She said, "I've shared that interview with everyone that I know, all my siblings, all my friends. And I share it with everyone I meet." You can't beat that, you know? And if every student did that, if people that come to platforms such as your platform
Mm.
did that, then we have a better chance of building actually a better world, really,
Could you
because
tell
that's
us the
the
name?
only way we
Could you
can build
tell
a
us the
better
name
world.
of the? Could you tell
A
us the name of the?
world where
Mhm.
we can still accept that there's a hierarchy of
Mm.
the worth of human beings, that Europeans are more worthy than
Mm.
non-Europeans, or that the lives of Israelis are much more worthy than the life of Palestinians. If that kind of perception continues with us, then given the type of sophisticated weapons that the world now has, then, when people talk about doom,
Mm.
I'm telling you, we are not just joking, it's serious. So we owe it to ourselves to build a better world by deconstructing how false this notion of white supremacy and racism really is.
So I like the fact that you said we deconstruct. And in terms of deconstructing, would you have a preferred medium, i.e., books, plays, or even podcasting,
Oh,
as we
there's
call
no
it?
limit, because we have different expertise. So, for example, if you're good as a playwright,
Hmm.
and of course, that was one of the things that Ngugi was very passionate about, right? A playwright. And I'm glad you brought that example. His plays were banned in his own country of Kenya, and he was exiled by an African government. Think about that.
Mm. Mm.
A play that is encouraging ordinary citizens to say, wait a minute, government is supposed to serve you.
Yeah, correct.
It's not the other way around.
Correct.
You're not supposed to be bowing to these ministers, presidents, as if they're planted there by God. No, they're there because supposedly they're supposed to be there to exercise the will of the people, right?
Mm.
And that's the message his play was disseminating. So if you can do it via play, if you can do it via book, which of course I attempt to do in Manufacturing Hate, if you can do it by film, you know, as our friend who made Lumumba, Raoul Peck, does with
Raubak, yeah.
Lumumba.
Mm-hmm.
It does, I'm not your
Negro.
Negro,
Yeah.
right? using the writings of James
James Baldwin.
Baldwin. If you can do it on social media platform, there's no shortage of the opportunities that now present itself to us, and publishing has become relatively much more easy now. And I'm glad actually we are discussing this topic. So this book, when I wrote this book, Manufacturing Hate,
Go on.
before I tell you what I want to tell you, let me also interject again. Writing is also very liberating. It is liberating. So whether you're writing a book, a play, or some other artistic creation, it's liberating. I felt by writing this book, I was also really, once and for all, removing that load that I felt I'd carried for such a long time. This demonization. Demonization is an attack. Attack does not have to be physical attack. The verbal attack is what is first done before the physical attack comes. So when I was writing this book, I was feeling that I was really shedding a lot of this negativity that had been heaped on us as a people. You see? So that's the other good thing in creation as well. But here's the other point I wanted to make. When the book came out in 2021, I had very difficult time getting reviews. I got a review in Review of African Political Economy by Professor Georges Ntalaja and Zongola, the great Congolese historian who teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Kirkus Review also did a very good review. That's Kirkus, so it's on Kirkus. And there's a media outlet called Journalism, Journal, and then -ISM, Journalism, by Richard Prince out of Maryland, DC area. And he also did a very good job. And I wrote a column on Face-to-Face Africa. I think I called it Ooga Booga Journalism, How Not to Write About Africa. So that was it. But nevertheless, even though it did not get much review or publicity, and the publisher did zero promotion, in the beginning, the book started moving very quickly. And I was getting decent checks of hundreds of dollars. And for first-time relationship with a publisher, that's not bad money, actually, right? Because it means if I'm getting hundreds of dollars, they're getting, probably a few thousands, right?
Yeah.
And then after many months, I started getting complaints. And you yourself experienced it. And you can share your own. But I got calls, emails from people who were saying, we would order the book from Amazon, take many, many months, or we would not get the book. And this was also now being reflected in the royalty, right? So I knew something is going on. Finally, last semester, so the publisher, on the publisher's website, publisher is called Kendall Hunt, Kendall Hunt, Hunt, publishing company. On that website, if you went, there was a platform to buy the digital version. You had the option to buy the physical book. So my students came to class one day. One student said, in the beginning of last semester, the first day of class, the professor, I want the physical version, but I can't get it. You only can buy the digital version from the publisher's website. I said, no, that's not true. There are two options. You must not be doing it right. She brought her computer to my desk. I logged on, and she was right. The publisher had stopped selling the physical copy of my book.
And yet you were
without
not
even
informed.
telling me. They only had the digital version. And that is why people were ordering and not getting the physical book as well. I was shocked. So I contacted the publisher. I said, okay, I want my copyright back. Publisher said, oh, we can't just give it back to you. You have to buy it. You have a contract. Last semester, the publisher wanted me to, because every semester I would let my students order the book. They wanted me to do the same last semester. I said, no. So they started the physical copy again, and they came back to me this semester to have my students order the book. I have about 100 students every semester between my 3 classes. I refused. I said, I'm not doing it. I want my copyright back. I'm not going to do any more business with them. So, in fact, I've launched a GoFundMe campaign. And anybody that wants to support, you can go to GoFundMe. If you put my name, Milton Allimadi, I've had in the past about 4 or 5 campaigns on different issues, and those have gone well. And you'll see the one that I'm doing now is called Win Back My Copyright, something like that. That's the headline.
Okay.
I want to get it back so I can make this available. My own publisher, I believe, is suppressing the sale of my books, just wants to keep it within academic community. And I could speculate, and I'm willing to speculate. I think the publisher was not familiar with the impact that the material might have, because the book implicates many people and organizations, including the New York Times, in disseminating purposefully the racist perception of Africa. So, for example, in the New York Times case, I went to their archives and I found, let me just give you 2 examples, 3. One example, I found a European American writer, Lloyd Garrison, complaining after his article that he had submitted from Nigeria. He covered the Biafra conflict. And he wrote an article, he sent it to New York. When he read the physical version, he was shocked. They had inserted a scene describing Nigerians dressed in grass leaf skirts. They concocted it out of nowhere.
In 1967.
And without his knowledge or permission, inserted it into his article. Talk about fake news today, right? The New York Times was practicing this in the 1960s. So I would not be shocked if somebody at the New York Times does not want this book to be widely disseminated. Do they have any relationship with Kendall Hunt? I have no idea. I'm just giving you 2 different sets of facts. The book stopped moving. The publisher even suppressed selling the physical version without telling me. And this is what it reveals about what happened at the New York Times. Let me give you another example. I found an example of a letter written by a famous New York Times journalist named Homer Bigart, who had won the Pulitzer Prize 2 times already. So they sent him to cover decolonization in Ghana. And then from there, he went to Congo. And he wrote about a personal letter to his editor named Emmanuel Friedman, how he's very dissatisfied with this assignment. He said, and I'm paraphrasing now, he said he pretty much prefers the primitive bush people in Africa, the primitive natives, not people like Kwame Nkrumah, who is like a Henry Wallace in burnt cork. He said he prefers the primitive bush people because, after all, cannibalism may be the best antidote to the population explosion that everybody's complaining about. And his so-called journalism reflected that attitude that he expressed in his personal letter. The demonization of Africans in the language of the so-called articles. I say so-called articles because he concocted some of the depiction and representations as well. So I would not be shocked if for some and clear reason why my publisher is not making this book now widely available. And I'll give you another interesting story. I have a friend who does book reviews for the New York Times, and he gave me the name of the editor for the reviews. He said, send them a copy. I sent a copy. Of course, the book was not reviewed. Not only was not reviewed, the editor did not even acknowledge
the
receiving a copy, a complimentary copy of the book. And here's the final hypocrisy on this same topic. In December 2021, if I'm not mistaken, either December 2020 or 2021, the Kansas City Star wrote a long editorial apology, apologizing for how historically their newspaper had demonized African American citizens of Kansas. And the New York Times wrote a long article about what Kansas City Star had done. So I said, okay. I wrote a letter to the publisher, Salzburger of the New York Times. And again, I sent a copy of my book. I said, I think what Kansas City Star did is good. And since you have your own history and how you depicted Africa, I think it would also be good for you to own up to your past and also to write a similar apology. No
Quiet.
acknowledgement.
Crickets.
No acknowledgement, and of course, no response. There's another third example, but I'm still trying to verify it. And if I verify what happened, we may have it in another future discussion, but I want to verify if what I suspect recently happened is true. And it, once again, would involve the New York Times, but I'm still working on verifying that. So these are the challenges that we face. But since they don't dominate the media space absolutely now, we can get it out there. In fact, but for social media and the new platforms, we will not be having this discussion right now.
True.
And perhaps, even though not enough people know about the book, no one would know about the book if we didn't have this new media platform as well. You see?
Yeah. So, I mean, away from the publishing industry, you in your personal space, how would you describe your writing process? Or can you share that, or is that a trade secret?
Okay, I only heard part of the question. How would I describe mine?
Okay, so away from the publishing industry,
yes,
how would you describe your writing process, if you can share? That's assuming it's not a trade secret.
My writing and how my writing evolved?
Yeah, your writing process, yes.
Oh, my writing process. Okay, very good. Wow, I don't know if there's a pattern, to be honest with you. Yeah, I don't know if there's a pattern. I do a lot of research, right?
Okay.
Like you, my books are marked heavily. Although now I try to get those, sticky things so you don't ruin books. Because one of my students showed me her copy of my book, right? When I was still letting them buy it. I'm not letting them do it anymore. Now I make photocopies of the sections I want them to read because I don't want the publisher to get another dime for my students. But when my students were still buying the book, one of them showed me her book. Every sentence was underlined, every page. I said, can you underline the whole thing, right? But I do read it. When I read, I mark.
Okay.
And then I take notes. So if anybody were to come to my apartment and these yellow notepads,
okay.
I
So
have
you take
hundreds of these. So I do make notes. Lots of notes. And then when I'm ready to write a chapter, I go back to those notes, of course, and I start writing. And each chapter is going to be very long. So, for example, if you go to my book, right? Some of the chapters are 4 pages, right?
Okay.
But the 4 pages came from a lot of intense editing. So that what I preserve, I think, is very concise and very precise. And that's how I do all my writing. I start very long and then eliminate. The writing part is easy. The editing part is where the real writing happens. So if you look at my book on Adwa, I think it's about maybe 100 pages. This is about 100 pages as well. Adwa took me maybe 2 years of editing. I don't rush because when it comes out, I want to be satisfied and happy with it. So I take my time. And sometimes I complete the manuscript and I put it aside for a while. And then I come back when I'm ready for the final edit. And then I may give it like 4 good edits. So Adwa, I've now done another version for a play,
Okay.
right? I've written it like a script for a play. And that one, I think it took me maybe 4 months of intense editing. I edited it at least 4 times.
Wow.
Even when I had shown people the first version and they said it was good, I went back to it, and I think
So
I,
trimmed
I,
it.
I managed to improve with every editing. Then by the fourth editing, when I read it again, I found nothing to edit. And that's when you're happy with the writing.
Mm.
Yeah. So I don't know if
Okay.
that answers,
I mean, that's a very powerful insight. I mean, there will be budding writers out there who would want to see behind the scenes as to what goes into making a brilliant book called "Manufacturing Hate and How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media." Is a book I would actually recommend. And like you
Thank you.
said, the power of writing in it. My copies are, as you can see, I write in them, so
Well, here's the deal. You'll be able to get a second copy that you won't mess up once I regain control of my copyright
we
from the
we
current publisher.
we
In
we
fact,
pray.
a
Go on.
student who just finished her master's at the London School of Economics, and she used my book as reference for her master's thesis. She has introduced me to a Tanzanian publisher for the African market. So I'll see if I can work out a deal with them so that I can make the book available in Africa as well.
That would be that is very, very poignant. I mean, the point of having this conversation is also to take this message out to the continent, because I think
Yes,
the continent often has stories and writings and plays and music done about it, but they're done by people who do not look like you and I. So you
absolutely.
can't really trust what their agenda is, you know.
And
And
I'm glad you said that too, because look
yeah,
at it this way.
mm,
Europeans write books about themselves, about Europe.
mm,
Americans, Europeans write
yeah,
books about
hmm
themselves.
hmm
And they also write books about us. Think about that.
exactly,
They get
exactly.
to write their own stories and our
And then
story.
yeah,
How many Africans write books about Europeans that are read in Europe and
mhm.
sets the understanding of what Europe is? So how can
I
Africans
mean,
be reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness
Heart
and say,
of
okay, yeah,
Darkness.
this is about Africa? Really?
Yeah, and this truly represents who I am as a person. You know, I mean,
And that's why I
I
love
was,
it that Achebe destroyed it,
mm,
and
yeah,
called
yeah, yeah. And,
Conrad a thoroughgoing racist. And I agree with him 100%.
and speaking of Achebe, he also gave us this reference in his book, Things Fall Apart, where he says, now if the man has learned how to shoot without missing, it is also
Yep,
important that the birds learn to fly without perching.
absolutely.
So we must do this because they've decided they're not going to rest. We also have to decide
Absolutely.
and take it upon ourselves to do this work.
Yeah.
Do
That's the
this
only
work.
way we can live. If you decided that you must live, then
Mhm.
you have to participate in decolonizing the minds of our people.
Yes, which is the topic of another brilliant book by Ngugi wa Thiong'o,
Exactly.
Decolonizing the Mind. So, in terms of, I mean, we're coming to the end of our conversation. Um, what sort of projects are you currently working on in 2024, and what can we expect from you? Would you be exploring, going to
Right.
rename some?
Actually, it's interesting you say that. The exploring,
Mm,
because as you said in the introduction of the show, why should they get to be the only ones that can discover the world?
mm,
So I think it was 4 years ago, and it's coming on the anniversary in April, when I was in London and I discovered that river that the natives call the Thames, and I renamed it River Gulu. And I posted the photo on my Facebook page. It's amazing how
mm.
things start. And that's all I did. And then a day or two, I
People
see it
started.
being retweeted. I didn't even tweet it myself. But somebody, a Kenyan actually, posted my image from my Facebook page and tweeted it. And then now it's been retweeted by tens of thousands of people, you know? And I saw a posting a couple of weeks ago by Larry Madowo, the Kenyan who's a CNN correspondent. And he posted a short video of himself in a hotel in London overlooking the Thames. And he said, I'm looking at the river that was discovered by the Uganda. So now I went and there's about 10,000 likes. Actually, then I posted a thank you to him for acknowledging my discovery. And then about 10,000 people liked my thanking him. So I'm definitely going to do a few more discoveries this year because I see that there's interest in this. And perhaps I'll come back to discuss my next discoveries with you.
No.
But here's another point I wanted to make also to many would-be writers or writers. Many of the projects that I end up publishing are books that I had done or manuscript and I had put aside for a while. Rarely do I get on a manuscript and finish it as a process without diversion. I put it aside and I find that when I come back to it, I see things that I was not seeing at that particular moment. This manuscript I had put aside. The book on Adwa I had put aside. Now I have I even hesitate to call it a children's book because it's really for everybody, but it's going to be accessible for youth and young people too, right? And it's a book about a young boy who has a huge head and who is teased by all his peers and in schools, always crying. So then this stranger comes visiting one morning and it gives him this beautiful drum that makes beautiful music. And whenever he touches it, but he's the only one who's allowed to play it. But you know how bullies are. So the bullies, who were bullying him in school, take it away and they play it. And the people that do that themselves, they become deformed. And people that, around them, different parts of their limbs become deformed. So now the whole community want to chase this boy away and even burn his home. He lives with his grandma. So the boy says, before this happens, let me return this drum to this old man. So he goes on a journey searching for this old man to return the drum. And a lot of other things happen during that journey. Obviously, I'm going to save that because I want people to read it in the book. But that is a manuscript that I first completed about 10 years ago. But now I'm feeling it again. I looked at it and I loved it. So I've now edited it. And the same young artist who illustrated my Adwa book is going to illustrate that. So that's my next project. But of course, I also have been doing research on Malcolm X. I want to write a book about his visit to Africa. I've been doing research on Nkrumah. And so those two would be maybe for next year, Malcolm X and Nkrumah.
Okay. Oh, yes. Comrade Milton Allimadi, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, no. It's my pleasure.
I
know you love teaching and I love teaching too. And that's how we can change the world,
I mean, it's a work that has to be done. I mean, I know growing up, the likes of Ali Maizuri with his TV series then, The Africans. Although, yes, people question, his medium, his motivations and what have you. But still, that was an eye-opener.
Absolutely.
Then for that, and I mean, sometimes it's the message, not the messenger, so, that's further cemented by.
And sometimes we see what is beyond being taught anyway.
Exactly.
And it certainly was much, much better than anything that was being taught and that was not being taught, you see?
Exactly. Because it created that window of curiosity to say, okay, what is beyond this?
Right.
Like there's a particular episode where he was talking about the history of the Nile.
Right, exactly. Oh no, I remember that.
Yeah. So and he went down this path, and
that was very good actually. I like that episode.
Yeah, the way it opened up into, it's like that's what history should do. Even the intrepid traveler himself, Basil Davison. Yes, again, we can question the vessel, but
Absolutely. You
the
have to
message.
take it and go beyond that. In fact, I use his documentaries on my class. And then I ask my students, okay,
Did
so
you
you
notice
think
any?
you like this, and you actually do like it. But how far did he go, and where did he stop short? You see? And then we discuss that part,
Yes.
So you don't abandon a body of knowledge. You take
No.
what is informative from there, and then you question what was left out. You see?
Well,
So
exactly.
that's how I approach it.
And why was it left out? Why? So what was the
Precisely.
function of self-censorship, as they will call it? Yes. So any last words, or
Well,
as they would
listen,
say,
just keep
any
doing what
words
you're
of
doing, and whatever you need me back for another episode, you know, I'm at your call and bidding.
yeah. Thank you very
As the
much.
great
Thank you.
Samora used to say, a luta continua, and part of that
Beatrice.
struggle is decolonizing the mind. So thank you for having me today.
No, thank you for hacking to the call. And yes, I'm truly appreciated. I truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Asante sana.
Thank you.